Have you ever experienced a connection that felt incredibly deep, yet somehow left you more confused than certain? One moment, someone makes you feel important, understood, and genuinely seen, and the next, they seem to vanish as though none of it ever happened. If you have experienced this, stay with me, because understanding what is happening can completely change how you view the entire relationship. You may not simply walk away feeling comforted. You may finally understand why you feel so attached, why their behavior affects you so strongly, and why their distance feels so painful. What you are experiencing is often much more complicated than simple confusion. In the beginning, everything can feel effortless. Conversations happen naturally, emotions become intense, and there is a powerful attraction that seems impossible to explain. You feel recognized in a way you have not experienced for a long time. Then, without any obvious reason, the atmosphere changes. They do not necessarily disappear overnight or openly reject you. Instead, their behavior shifts little by little. Messages become less frequent. Their enthusiasm seems weaker. The warmth you once felt begins turning into emotional distance. Suddenly, you are left wondering what happened and whether you somehow caused it. You start reviewing every conversation, every interaction, every expression, searching for the exact moment when something changed. You look for an explanation, but there is rarely one. That can be more painful than an actual ending, because nothing has been clearly closed. There is no direct rejection, no honest conversation, and no final explanation that allows you to process what happened. Instead, there is an uncomfortable space filled with unanswered questions. And when something remains uncertain, the mind has a difficult time releasing it because there is no clear ending to accept. That is why your thoughts can become consumed by questions that slowly steal your peace. Did they genuinely care about me? Did I misunderstand the entire connection? Was what I felt real, or was I simply imagining something that was never there? Why can I feel so strongly while they seem completely unaffected? These questions can gradually make you connect your own value to the way they behave. When they move closer, you feel wanted and important. When they become distant, you immediately feel rejected or unworthy. But this emotional reaction does not mean there is something wrong with you. Human beings naturally respond strongly to uncertainty and inconsistency. When affection, attention, or emotional closeness appears and disappears unpredictably, the mind can become even more focused on receiving the next moment of connection. You begin craving the emotional reward created by their attention. Eventually, you may find yourself pursuing the feeling they once gave you rather than simply pursuing the person themselves. This is one reason letting go can feel so difficult. It is not necessarily because this person is flawless or because nobody else could ever make you happy. Their unpredictability itself may have made the attachment stronger. Yet there is another important part of the story that is often overlooked when dealing with avoidant behavior. People with avoidant attachment patterns may experience emotional closeness very differently from someone who naturally seeks reassurance and intimacy. Connection can feel wonderful to them, but deep intimacy can also activate fear. It is not always that they feel nothing. Sometimes the opposite is closer to the truth. The emotional intensity becomes difficult for them to regulate. As the relationship becomes more meaningful, fears about vulnerability, dependence, losing independence, or being emotionally exposed can begin rising underneath the surface. Instead of moving closer when those feelings appear, they may instinctively create distance. From your perspective, genuine affection naturally means increasing closeness. For them, intense closeness may sometimes trigger the need to step back. That creates one of the most painful relationship patterns imaginable. You move toward them because you want reassurance and connection, while they move away because closeness has activated their defenses. You become more attentive, and they become more distant. You offer more emotional energy, and they respond by creating even greater space. Eventually, you may stop focusing on your own emotional health and become almost completely occupied with understanding their behavior. You wait for their messages. You examine how they word things. You notice changes in their tone. You remember every small moment when they showed affection and hold on to those memories because they seem to prove that the connection was real. Somewhere inside, you may even recognize that the situation is hurting you, but another part of you refuses to release it. Why? Because despite everything that feels unstable, something about the connection still feels incredibly genuine, and that feeling can keep you trapped much longer than you ever expected. You may think you are trying to get that person back, but sometimes what you are really trying to recover is the version of them you experienced at the beginning. You miss the person who listened to you, noticed you, made you feel special, and created the impression that something meaningful was developing. Your mind remembers those moments and creates a powerful expectation. If it happened once, perhaps it can happen again. If they were capable of making you feel that connected before, maybe the relationship can return to that place. But there is an uncomfortable truth worth recognizing. A connection can be powerful without being peaceful. Some relationships expose emotional patterns you never realized were controlling you. They force you to confront what you tolerate in the name of love. They reveal how much uncertainty you are willing to endure simply because you want to feel chosen. That realization can hurt, but it can also become incredibly freeing. Because once you recognize the pattern, you can stop automatically blaming yourself for someone else's withdrawal. You no longer have to believe that their distance proves you are not good enough. You do not have to constantly pursue an explanation from someone who is unwilling or unable to provide one. You do not have to make yourself smaller, quieter, or easier to keep someone comfortable. Yet if you are still inside this cycle, understanding that intellectually does not instantly make the emotional attachment disappear. You may still be wondering why something that feels so powerful can remain so unstable. The answer is rarely found in love alone. There are psychological patterns involved, emotional triggers, attachment strategies, and two very different ways of responding to intimacy. When these patterns collide, both people can become trapped in a dynamic neither one consciously planned. And unless the pattern becomes visible, it can repeat again and again. But when you finally understand what is happening, something important changes. You stop seeing only their behavior, and you begin seeing your own emotional responses with much greater clarity. This also explains why moving forward can sometimes feel impossible. You may tell yourself that you are finished. You may decide to focus on work, friends, family, hobbies, or your own goals. You might even create intentional distance because you believe that enough space will finally help you detach. Then, just when you begin feeling stronger, they suddenly appear again. Maybe it is a short message, a reaction to something you posted, a casual question, or some tiny indication that they are still paying attention. Nothing dramatic has to happen. Sometimes the smallest interaction is enough to bring all those old emotions rushing back. Suddenly, the emotional progress you thought you had made feels fragile. It can feel as though you are trapped inside a cycle that you never consciously agreed to join. Yet there is a psychological reason these situations can feel so difficult to close. When a person creates a strong emotional impact but leaves without genuine closure, your mind may continue treating the relationship like an unfinished story. The brain naturally searches for patterns, explanations, and conclusions. When there is no clear ending, it keeps returning to the situation, examining what happened and imagining what might happen next. This is why physical absence does not necessarily create emotional absence. Someone can be completely gone from your daily life and still occupy a significant amount of mental space. Adding consistency to that situation, and the attachment can become even stronger. Attention followed by silence, affection followed by coldness, closeness followed by distance creates an unpredictable emotional environment. Your mind begins waiting for the next positive moment. You are not simply remembering the person anymore. You are anticipating the next emotional reward, and that anticipation can make stepping away feel much harder than logic would suggest. But this dynamic is not necessarily happening only on your side. An avoidant person may experience their own internal conflict even if they do not express it openly. They might look detached, act unaffected, or behave as though the relationship means very little, while still noticing your absence and feeling the change when you stop responding the way you once did. When you create space, the familiar dynamic changes. They may no longer feel certain that you will remain available regardless of how much distance they create. That uncertainty can bring their attention back toward the relationship. Sometimes they return with a clear intention, But other times they simply make a small move toward connection without fully understanding why. They may reach out just enough to restore the emotional bond. The moment you respond, hope can return. You begin thinking that perhaps they finally understand, perhaps this time will be different, perhaps the relationship is moving towards something more stable. And then, once again, the distance appears. That repetition can be emotionally exhausting. The same pattern returns: connection, hope, closeness, uncertainty, withdrawal, silence, and confusion. Eventually, you may start questioning yourself instead of questioning the dynamic. You wonder whether you are too sensitive, whether your expectations are unrealistic, or whether you somehow demand more than you should. But wanting consistency does not automatically mean you are asking for too much. The real issue may be that you are emotionally invested in a relationship where stability has not been established. Emotional safety comes from knowing where you stand, not constantly guessing. When that safety is missing, your nervous system can remain on alert. You become attentive to every small signal because you are trying to predict what will happen next. Even during periods when nothing is actually happening, your mind can remain busy analyzing the relationship. That constant mental engagement is exhausting because part of you is always waiting for reassurance. Over time, this kind of uncertainty can change what you consider normal. You may begin accepting behavior that you once would have recognized as emotionally unhealthy. You might convince yourself that the intensity proves the relationship must be special. But intensity and emotional health are not the same thing. Sometimes an extremely powerful emotional experience is simply evidence that something inside the relationship is unstable. Even so, the connection may continue appearing in unexpected ways. A memory suddenly comes to mind. A song reminds you of them. A familiar place brings back an emotional moment. You may think about them without intentionally trying to. Logic tells you that moving forward would be easier, yet your emotions continue insisting that something remains unfinished. That creates hope. Maybe someday they will understand what this connection meant. Maybe they will finally become emotionally available. Maybe circumstances will change and everything will eventually make sense. But while you are holding on to that possibility, another process is quietly developing inside you. You are beginning to recognize the pattern. Instead of only feeling the connection, you are starting to observe what it does to you. You notice how your mood changes according to their behavior. You recognize how much time you spend waiting, analyzing, hoping, and interpreting. You begin seeing how the relationship influences your decisions and even your perception of yourself. This awareness is extremely important because you cannot change a pattern you refuse to see. Once you become conscious of the cycle, you can no longer pretend that the emotional intensity is the entire story. You begin asking what this relationship is actually giving you and what it is costing you. That is when your internal perspective starts changing. You are no longer simply reacting every time they appear or disappear. You are beginning to pause before responding. You are creating enough emotional distance to observe yourself instead of automatically chasing the next moment of reassurance. And eventually, a different question begins to emerge. Instead of constantly asking, "Why are they behaving this way?" you start asking, "Why am I continuing to participate in something that leaves me feeling this way?" That question is powerful because it moves your attention away from trying to control another person's emotions and brings it back to your own choices. You stop making their behavior the center of your emotional world. You begin recognizing your own needs, boundaries, patterns, and fears. This does not mean the connection suddenly becomes meaningless. It means you are finally capable of seeing it without losing yourself inside it. You can acknowledge that something felt real while also admitting that it may not be giving you the stability you need. You can care about someone without allowing their inconsistency to determine your value. And that shift marks the beginning of genuine emotional growth, because the journey is no longer only about figuring them out. It becomes about discovering yourself. This is the point where many people either become even more lost or begin rebuilding themselves in a completely different way. The goal is not to become cold, detached, or incapable of loving deeply. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself in order to preserve a connection. When you understand your own emotional patterns, you become less controlled by every message, every silence, every sudden return, and every withdrawal. You can recognize what is happening without immediately reacting to it. You can allow someone to have their own fears and defenses without taking responsibility for fixing them. Most importantly, you can begin separating your worth from their ability to show up consistently. Their avoidance does not define your value. Their return does not suddenly increase your worth, and their disappearance does not reduce it. The deeper lesson is not simply understanding why an avoidant person pulls away. It is understanding why their distance had the power to pull you away from yourself. That is where the real transformation begins. You start realizing that love should not require you to constantly prove that you are worthy of being chosen. You do not have to chase someone into emotional availability. You do not have to decode every silence or turn every small gesture into evidence of a future. If a connection is meaningful, that meaning should eventually be supported by behavior, consistency, communication, and mutual effort. Understanding attachment psychology can help you recognize why certain patterns happen, but understanding them should not become another reason to tolerate endless uncertainty. Awareness is meant to give you freedom, not another excuse to stay stuck. Once you see the difference between emotional intensity and emotional security, your perspective changes. You can still appreciate what the connection taught you without allowing it to control your life. And from that point forward, the most important relationship you begin rebuilding is the one you have with yourself. In the beginning, this new awareness can feel strangely uncomfortable because you start noticing everything you previously overlooked. You begin recognizing how much effort you were putting into keeping the connection alive, how frequently you adjusted your own emotions to accommodate theirs, and how many times you remained quiet because speaking honestly felt like it might push them away. Eventually, a difficult realization starts becoming impossible to ignore. You were not simply participating in the relationship, you were carrying much of its emotional weight. You were trying to keep something alive that was not being supported equally from both sides. And realizing this does not immediately feel liberating, it can actually feel painful because you can no longer tell yourself that everything was balanced. You can no longer believe that another conversation, another sacrifice, or another attempt from you would suddenly make everything stable. Clarity can feel cruel before it becomes healing. This is often the stage when something inside you begins to crack open, not necessarily because of what the other person did, but because you finally understand what you were doing to yourself. You realize that you are tired, not because caring is exhausting, but because you were carrying the responsibility for connection alone. You were constantly stretching beyond your limits, giving more emotional energy than you were receiving in return. And eventually, exhaustion creates awareness. You stop responding instantly. You stop feeling responsible for explaining yourself over and over again. You stop chasing tiny moments of reassurance just to feel secure for a few hours. This change does not come from resentment or a desire to punish them. It comes from finally understanding the pattern. You recognize that every time you increased your effort, the relationship did not become more stable. Instead, the imbalance became even more obvious. So gradually, you begin taking your energy back. That shift is difficult because part of you is still emotionally invested in the outcome. Somewhere inside, there is still hope that everything might suddenly change. You may still imagine a future where they understand, open up, and finally give you the consistency you have been waiting for. But alongside that hope, something stronger begins developing. You start making different choices. You begin choosing calm instead of emotional intensity. You prefer certainty over endless guessing. You start protecting your peace instead of constantly protecting the connection. Most importantly, you begin choosing yourself. That can feel unfamiliar because you are no longer operating from the habits that once controlled you. You are not trying to secure their attention at any cost. You are beginning to protect your own emotional presence. And when that happens, distance begins to appear naturally. You do not have to create dramatic separation. You simply stop giving unlimited access to someone who has not shown they can handle it responsibly. This natural change in your behavior can alter the entire dynamic. The emotional availability you once offered so freely is no longer automatically there. The attention they became accustomed to receiving becomes less predictable. The access they once had to your thoughts, emotions, and time begins to narrow. and eventually they may notice. It may not happen immediately, and they may not openly admit it, but the difference becomes difficult to ignore. When someone becomes accustomed to having your presence available whenever they choose, your absence can suddenly make that presence visible. They begin recognizing what has changed. They feel that you are no longer responding from the same emotional position. And that can create discomfort because the old balance of distance and pursuit no longer works. You are not chasing them anymore. You are not sitting around waiting for them to decide what they want. You are not repeatedly trying to prove that you are worth choosing. The version of you they once expected to always remain available is changing, and that forces them to experience the relationship differently. This can create an unexpected opportunity for reflection on their side. When your behavior changes, they may suddenly have to confront the space they once avoided thinking about. But you have to be careful here, because this is also where many people accidentally destroy the progress they have made. The moment they notice a small change from the other person, they rush back in. One message creates excitement, one reaction creates hope, and suddenly every boundary they built disappears. They open the door completely before seeing whether anything has actually changed. They return to the same emotional position they were trying to escape, and before long the old cycle starts again. But if you remain grounded, something much deeper begins to develop within you. You become less reactive. You start trusting yourself more. You realize that you can survive uncertainty without chasing it. You can care about someone without constantly abandoning your own needs. And slowly, emotional stability begins replacing emotional dependence. That internal stability changes what impresses you. Temporary attention no longer feels as powerful as it once did. A sudden message does not automatically convince you that everything is different. You stop confusing inconsistency with mystery and stop interpreting emotional distance as proof that the connection must be unusually deep. You become more aware of what actually makes a relationship healthy. You want consistency. You want mutual effort. You want emotional safety. You want actions that support words rather than moments of attention followed by long periods of absence. This is real growth, and it usually does not happen dramatically. There may be no big announcement or obvious turning point. It develops quietly through repeated decisions to honor yourself. And once that growth reaches a certain level, it becomes difficult to return to the person you were before. Even if they come back, even if they show interest, even if they suddenly want another chance, you are no longer approaching them from the same place. The urgency has changed because your understanding has changed. You begin seeing things that previously escaped your attention. Patterns become easier to recognize. Red flags no longer look romantic simply because they are wrapped in intense emotions. You do not immediately overlook inconsistency because you are afraid of losing someone. And that clarity gives you a different kind of strength. It is not power over another person. It is power over your own reactions, decisions, and boundaries. The outcome no longer has complete control over your emotional state. You stop living in anticipation, waiting for the next message, the next conversation, or the next sign that things might finally work. Instead, you become comfortable standing in what you already understand, and from that position, the entire meaning of the connection changes. It is no longer the center of your life. It becomes information. It shows you what you are willing to accept, what you have outgrown, and what kind of emotional experience you want moving forward. Eventually, reality has to reveal whether the relationship can meet the person you have become. That is when the truth becomes much easier to see because you no longer need words to explain what is happening. Their actions begin speaking for themselves. Once you have reached a place of emotional stability, the constant guessing starts disappearing. You are no longer trying to force a particular outcome or interpret every small behavior. At that point, there are essentially two directions the situation can take. Either the other person rises to meet the new standard of the relationship, or the connection gradually fades because they are unwilling or unable to change. The difference is that you are no longer approaching them from desperation. You are approaching them from self-respect. If there is genuine depth underneath the confusion, your change may require them to respond differently because the old dynamic can no longer continue in the same way. They cannot casually appear whenever they want and expect unlimited emotional access. They cannot continue offering minimal effort while receiving everything from you. Eventually, they have to decide whether they are willing to participate differently.